Great. So thank you everyone for joining us today on our COVID-19 web series. Today's session is going to be a little bit different than the usual real estate related topics. This was kind of inspired by late events. I think a lot of people has potentially lost their jobs and this and that. So, I used to be an IT worker. So I used to work for a high tech company. And it can be very stressful, even though I'm thinking like I'm insulated from all this downtime. But when you think about it, travel sector is down, real estate housing is down. Like, so if we're in a tech company that's related with these, like Airbnb, we could be affected by this. So I think it's very important to also have the job, like the skill to like lend yourself another job during this downtime. And the good news is there's plenty of high tech job where we live in Seattle as an alternative. So it's maybe time to kind of dust off your resume and get really good at interview. Just so in case if you even want to looking for a dream job, this is a time to kind of look for them. So I have Chris Bruno over here. So Chris is amazing. He used to work for Zillow, right, Chris, as a CFO. And so me and Chris by chance met each other because we have a common acquaintance that our kids goes to the same school. And over the time, Chris has starting to become my business coach and give me a lot of guidance and advice moving forward with my business. So that's how we met. Thank you, Chris, for joining us today. So I thought for this session, it would be really great to have Chris's perspective on what kind of resume stands out for a high-tech company job or a white-collar job. And also all these tricks that they throw at you as interviewers would like to kind of like look behind the curtain what the thought process and etc. is. Without further ado, here's Chris. Chris, tell us a little about yourself.
Sure. Hi, thank you, Elisa. I was not CFO at Zillow, just to be sure. I was general manager and I was VP of finance. So I don't want to like overinflate my title, but it's close enough. So thank you. This is actually my first live webinar that I've done. So I'm super nervous. I'm sweating a lot. But good thing I'm wearing sweatpants because that's all I wear these days. I'm sure everybody else too. Getting really, really fashionable with my different sweatpants. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, so I worked for Zillow for almost 6 years. I worked for 2 other tech companies prior to that. So Rhapsody, which was a music service company, which was born out of Real Networks, which is where I came from initially. So 15 years in tech land. I've been in charge of finance teams, analytics teams, data science teams, sales teams, operations teams, and I've had executive scope, so large teams in the hundreds. So I've seen and interviewed a lot of different types, from technical people. My most technical folks were in the analytics org, so data scientists and data engineers. I've interviewed salespeople. I've interviewed executives. I've interviewed finance people. So pretty wide breadth. I've never gone through technical engineering loops. Just I'm sure some of you on the call are engineers, so I'm not going to get into what makes for a good technical interview. And everything I'm going to share with you is from my own experience. So, sort of my own perspectives and biases, if you will, but also my experience with the different companies. And I actually put some of this in an article, which I posted on LinkedIn earlier this week, which you can check out. So I'll talk about some of the things I mentioned in there and probably expand a little bit. But hopefully just to give you some practical guidance on how to approach the entire process, what I've seen work in my time, the way I work is I sort of pick up bits of knowledge from all of my different experiences and different people. A lot of what has gone into my resume creation over the years actually got from an executive recruiter who was a good friend of mine, who actually sadly passed away a number of years ago. But she really helped me think about how to prepare a really effective resume, how to communicate well in a resume, because there's a lot of ways to do it poorly and in a way that's going to make the person reading its eyes glaze over. But she also taught me the power of networking. And I know that a lot of you guys in the situation that you're in now, if you've just been recently laid off, I'm very sorry about that. But there is a lot of power in building and maintaining a network. And one of the things this woman did for me is sort of demystify what it means to build a network and how you go about doing that. And I'm mentioning this as part of this because it does help you in the process, but it's a long-term investment, right? So if you've not done it up to this point, it's probably not going to help you much now, but it's definitely something for you to keep in mind going forward. And the way she broke it down for me, and this is one piece that I didn't talk about in the article, and we'll get to the resumes and the agenda that Elisa wants to get to, but building a network is actually a lot easier than you think it is. And the way that she had guided me to do this, and what I started doing probably 10 years ago, is you just start having coffee, or in today's world, a Zoom, with people you know, your friends, your family, your neighbors, people you work with. And you just reach out and you just bit by bit have conversations with people. And it's pretty amazing how quickly that enables your network to expand very organically. And the value in doing that over the years is that when it comes time to, if you feel like you need to rely on somebody for something or you need something, you're not coming to them and asking for a favor. You're just continuing a conversation that's been ongoing for years and years. And it takes time and it takes investment. And it's also challenging when you're working at a particular company because you get so immersed in the day-to-day there. I know I've been there. And so you really have to kind of go out of your way to make that happen. And it may not help you in the here and now. And so as long as you approach it as long-term investment, it will benefit you when you need it the most. So that's just good practical advice for anybody, any professional to keep in mind.
Yeah. So Chris, I have a question over here. By the way, if you have a question, I always do this housekeeping. I forgot to do it, but put your question in the Q&A. But if you want to just chit chat with everyone else, you can chat on the chat box. So we did have one question that came up that said, hey, can we like make it not techie? To Chris's point earlier, we're actually trying to focus this session on more the behavior questions that people have. Because for tech job, like technical stuff, there's a lot of boot camps and books that you can kind of read. I found it's most challenging, these behavior questions. You never know like what's the right answer, what is people looking for and all that sort of stuff. So hence the session. Now, Chris, I have another question for networking. So when I was working at a high tech job, even now, like when you talk about networking, so I always feel like, hey, I shouldn't come with like kind of contrived, like, hey, I have something to gain, so therefore I'm networking. That's just my mentality. So like, how would you kind of approach it, even for someone who is a little bit maybe introvert? Hey, grab a coffee, but sometimes I'm like, hey, if I'm talking with executive, I don't really know what topics to even like pick and ask. Is there a set of questions that kind of do the icebreaker? Now from there, we can kind of flow on what are some most important questions that you typically kind of engage these conversations with to start with.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, because it can be intimidating. And and like you said, for folks that tend towards introversion, it's probably not their favorite activity. And it's not, again, to demystify, what was demystified for me is, in my mind, before I figured out what this really meant, is I always thought you go to networking events and you glad hand people and you're trying to find strangers and talk to them and talk about what you're doing. It's not about that. I mean, you can do that, but that's not, to me, that's not what works. What works is just having a normal conversation with somebody, asking them about themselves. Like when you ask somebody about themselves and you ask open-ended questions, it gets them talking, because most people like to talk about themselves. And so you go and you just ask, hey, like, what's your story? What's your journey been like? And then you ask, like, the one thing I try to always do at the end of a conversation with somebody who I don't know very well, and I think I can learn something from, is, what's one piece of advice you have for me? And that's just a great way to sort of end it all. But you're just having a conversation. You're asking them about them, what they've learned, where they've been. Then you tell them about what you're up to, right? What you're doing. And then you could talk about your goals, your aspirations, but you sort of just let the conversation flow very naturally. And that's the magic of it. And when you do it like that, to my point in the article, and what will apply across the interview process too, is just be authentic. Just be yourself. Like, you don't need to be having the conversation for any other reason than you're probably going to learn something from this person. And that is actually the most powerful aspect of networking, is you always learn through these conversations. And it may or may not result in anything now. In fact, most times it's not going to. But if you just kind of like lodge it in your memory banks, that's going to help you be a better person, a better professional. You're going to help you be more well-rounded, which is going to help you no matter what you do.
Gotcha. So just to kind of tee off that session before we move on to the resume critique, who is your favorite interviewer?
My
If you,
favorite interviewer,
yeah,
like someone who's interviewed me in the past.
yeah, or someone on the TV. My favorite is Larry King. I mean,
Oh,
yeah,
interesting. That's a good question. I don't know if I have one off the top of my head, to be honest. Who's a very good? I don't know. You guys are probably gonna
okay,
I'll
yeah.
probably take
The
some.
reason why
No,
I'm
no. Well, I
asking
actually have
is,
an answer, but I might get some flack for it. I actually think Howard Stern's a pretty good interviewer. I don't
oh,
like. I used to listen to Howard Stern a lot back in the day when I lived in New York City. And granted, it's Howard Stern, so he's Howard Stern, so he's crass
yeah,
and all that. But if you actually listen to Howard Stern, he is very good at getting people to open up about all sorts of stuff,
yeah.
right? And he really probes. But that's actually the magic of Howard. If anyone's ever listened to Howard Stern, that's what he does really well. Forget like the topics, but he's very
Yeah.
good at getting people to open up.
Yeah. So the reason why I'm asking that question for the audience over here is it may be good to kind of go back and look at Larry King, look at Howard Stern, look at Oprah. How did they do the interview? And that may be a skill for you to have when you're networking, really be inquisitive, ask what the other person's about to kind of opening that up and to kind of build a relationship that way. Cool. All right. I think let's see some resumes.
Okay, so you want me to share?
Sure. So we pulled a few sample resume. I had an old resume of mine. It's not up to date. I had a couple of jobs after that. Um, so we want to kind of share taking a real example and just having Chris coming in and take a really look at it from a hey interviewer perspective. What kind of jumped out at the resume? What is good? What can be improved? To kind of give a good example of what people are kind of looking for.
Okay, Elisa, can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Cool. Okay, so this is John Joe, and let's see. I made comments about this. Um, I guess this came across to me as a very typical resume, and certainly in the even just the way it's laid out in the font, uh, it looks very familiar to something I used in the past, which is fine. It's serviceable. To the point I made in the article that I posted. I think you want to change it up just a little bit, right? Like if you think about from the perspective of a recruiter or a hiring manager, their eyes are going to be bleeding if they're trying to hire for a role. They're probably feeling pretty anxious about it, and if they're in a fortunate position, they're getting a lot of people applying for that role, and so their eyes can be bleeding going through these resumes. So anything that you can do to make yours stand out just a little bit visually, whether it's you find maybe an off the beaten path type of font, um, maybe use a little bit of color. There's one of the resumes in here does a good job of that, which I'll show you next. Um, just something that is a little bit different, and something that it's something that looks visually appealing to you. Like what I found is people are very personal about their fonts. So if there's a font that you particularly like, as long as it's not like Webdings or Wingdings, and it's come out looking like gobbledygook, it might be worth using. So that was sort of my first bit of feedback on here, just in the way this is laid out. In terms of what is actually populated in the resume here, there is what to me is missing from here is there's no standalone skills section, which I think is you want to be able to put skills in a way that will catch the recruiter's eye or the algorithm's eye. So when I say algorithms, a lot of recruiters use these days to capture what are the keywords that relate to a particular function that I want to make sure, like for example, financial modeling or codes in SQL or something like that. If you put that into sort of its own section, it's a good way for it to stand out. Um, and the other thing about skills is don't just list your hard skills, but you can also list the soft skills that you've acquired over time that may be valuable for the position you're applying for. So for example, um, if you're in sales, maybe you want to put persuasion, empathy, presentation skills. If you're a marketer, like effective writing skills. But these skills that aren't necessarily hard, but they're soft and extremely important to the job you're going to be doing. give thought to what those are and what you've acquired over time, and put those in there too, because those types of skills actually don't show up very often in resumes. And I think that could be a very interesting way for you to differentiate yourself. So, but having a skills section, I think, either below the top. So a general comment also is what I like at the top of a resume, and which I think Elise's, which is coming up next, is kind of a professional snapshot of who you are, that kind of describes your brand. That's also missing here. And so when I get into Elise's, I'll show you what I mean by that. But that's the way I think a good way to lead into any resume. So put that at the top. It could be a handful of bullet points, or perhaps eloquently worded sentence that kind of just gives the reader a sense for what you really are as a professional and what your brand is. Start there, and then have the skills section below that is a good way I've seen, because it kind of stands out at the top, and it's an easy way for people to sort and sift. And then in this resume in particular, the bullet points they still feel like task oriented to me. And I talked about this in my article, which, it's fine, but I think what you really want to think about, what were the problems that you solved while you were in a particular situation, and what were the key accomplishments? And really talk about that in a way, like in a meaningful way, not just I did X, Y, and Z, but I solved the problem, and here was what that accomplishment looked like, and be selective about those, right? So try not to overload any one particular area, but really think about those meaningful problems you solved and what the outcomes were. And so it's in here, but it still feels a little too crowded, and it still feels a little too task oriented for me.
So like a kind of more the outcome, the impact potentially to the company, the projects that you've done, versus just kind of listing out like I've done this, but like, hey, what does it actually impact for?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
we did have a question that was really interesting over here. Just a second. This is about the bots. So is there really a bot like that kind of scans through them, or when you say like the whole process of scanning, it's kind of like a more HRs that kind of using their eyes and like process to look through them, is it actually a bot?
I think it depends. It depends on the company you're talking about.
Okay.
And I suspect that the more sophisticated, more mature companies are using technology in different forms to actually scan through resumes. So
Gotcha.
I think it's, to my point about making sure that in the article I said, know what you're applying for, know what the function is, and have a sense of what do you think they're looking for, and make sure that those words show up in your resume. And again, be honest about it, right? Like, don't put a word there if it doesn't apply to what you've done. But you want to make sure, like, that's sort of the box checking part of what should show up on a resume. For whether it's a human or if it's a robot, one of those two is going to be looking for certain keywords. So make sure you get those in there, because that was sort of like, that's a very high level screening process that they may be going through.
Yeah, so I don't know if we have answer to this question, but then the follow-up question is, do you have tips for optimizing resumes for SEO to get past the bots?
That one I don't. However, I've got a lot of friends in recruiting, and I could definitely go a little further with them and figure out if there are more specific ways to do that. So I don't want to give you bad information on this.
Or potentially just working with a bot and making sure you're highlighting the skill sets that you have and using a more common term, that would stand out to the bot, because at the end, the bot's kind of looking for the right candidate for the right job. And it's keywords probably the interviewer has keyed in to say, I'm looking for someone who has SQL database background, or who is a bookkeeper who has financial background, or it can be real estate jobs, someone who has sold properties before in this particular area, right? So it can be applied to general. So I want to kind of make it a little bit more general, even though we're kind of talking about the tech companies over here. Great, awesome.
Good question.
Cool. Sorry.
Cool. Okay, so that was my feedback on John Doe. So let's flip over to Elisa. So I really liked Elisa. I'm not just trying to butter up the host here, but I liked her, the way she.
Yeah, I don't work in tech anymore. It doesn't matter anymore.
I know. You're like
an old resume. Yes.
No longer applicable. So to my point earlier about professional summary, I like what she got up there, because that it's sort of gives the reader an immediate sense of who she really is. And it sort of enables you to understand Elise's brand very quickly without having to sift through a bunch of different experiences and a bunch of different tasks or outcomes. And you can even go as far as to brand yourself, right? Like, what do you want to be referred to? I think because we do this on LinkedIn, or a lot of people do this on LinkedIn. It's almost like you're right underneath your profile. Talk about yourself as you want people to think about you. Like when I was doing this, I think the last thing I had was probably experienced media and high tech executive, right? So it's very broad, but like, okay, that kind of gets people thinking. But think about how you want to be characterized in a short phrase. And you could even put that at the top of the resume as well to lead into the professional summary that you see here on Elise's. I like the look and the feel, the sort of the softer font. I like the smaller bullet points. So I have a real aversion to bullet points in general in presentation formats, which I consider a resume to be a form of a presentation because I think it clutters. And so she did a nice job of having, it's good. Like they're tiny little dots, so it enumerates each line. But if you get like big chunky bullet points, to me, it just draws from the experience. And like bullet points in PowerPoint, this is sort of a side note, huge no-no. Like you do not want to be doing that. But there is a time and a place for bullet points. Don't get me wrong. Like I often write in bullet point form, whether it's one with a sub A, B, C, so on and so forth. But that's in long form, and that's in when you're sort of like talking through, like, here's what we need to get through. That's fine. But if you're presenting, to me, it draws away from the entire experience. But she did a nice job of making this subtle here.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, Chris. You mentioned about the bullet points because I'm like the opposite. I think in bullet points. So when someone like give me a whole paragraph, I scan through them. But like for me, it was more like, hey, I like, so that was really good for me, even thinking about like, oh, maybe some audience and maybe not like preferring bullet points. It just so by chance this bullet point was founded this way. But that is a very interesting insight.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you,
think
Chris.
again, this is me, right? So I'm but one human. You need it in this format because you're going to have line by line by line. The way you did it is really nice because it's very subtle. Again, you want this thing to be visually appealing. You want it to be as easy on the eyes as possible. The one before, let me just go back.
So I think also I
See
noticed
this?
that in some of our sample, we had like a one pagers. Now, is that a misnomer that like all resume needs to fit in one page? Because
That's a
clearly
misnomer.
mine doesn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a misnomer. I used to think that too. You don't want it to be 6 pages, but if you're going to accrue so much experience at some point
Yeah.
that to try to jam it all into one is going to be challenging. So I wouldn't worry about that too much.
Okay. And maybe keep it in 2 pages or 2 or 3 pages. Like,
Yeah, 2 to 3 is. I think mine ended up being 3 at the peak. I imagine. You can drop some older stuff off of there, and you
right.
can sort of make a decision about what you think is actually relevant. But up to 3 pages is fine. I think 1 to 2 is probably best.
Yeah. Got it. We did have a live question over here. I thought that was a really great question. What's the best way to describing you if you have a different kind of experience? Do you just mention the years you have been working on, or do some approximation of years of experience you have on a specific fields? I guess you're in particular kind of talking about the top session over here and maybe also down in the description of each work experience over here. So how do you kind of summarize, let's say someone who's working in, like construction, like what's kind of the best way to kind of summarize your experience, or someone who's working with sales, let's say. Do you have any tips?
So
How do
if
I
you're
kind of
coming
summarize
from
it? Yeah.
if you're coming from a different alleyway altogether,
Yeah.
and you're looking to change things up, how would you describe that?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'm trying to think. I have not seen a lot of those in my time, but I would imagine, again, you're going to hear me use like this theme a lot, but be authentic about it and explain, because you can't hide the fact that, okay, you're making a change. You want people to know that, and so you could talk about, you can reference what you've been, but you can also say aspiring software developer, construction worker turned aspiring software developer, something like that, that just gives people a sense of, okay, this person's taken a hard left or a hard right. And so they're going to be less experienced, but maybe that's okay, right? Maybe they're applying. Again, there's an underlying assumption in all of this, and I mentioned this in the article too, which is you're applying for a role that you actually have a shot at getting, right? If like I today decided to apply to be a software engineer, there's not a chance on earth that I would get that job, nor should I be applying for that. So like have awareness that what you're applying for, you're reasonably qualified for. But if you're starting out new, then you can only go on the experiences you have. So be open and honest about those and talk about them. And maybe you can talk about what you're looking for as well. And that's the other thing in the summary, depending on what you're applying for and what you're looking for, you can also allude to, looking for a great role in product management or becoming an influencer in a product org at a great blah, blah, blah. You could talk about that too. So it could be, this top section can be more plain speak than the rest of it. And I think that's a good way to kind of lead into it all.
Gotcha. And the other way, and I may have another answer for Diego here too, is if you have a different kind of experience, think about it, is it important for the job that you're applying? So oftentimes when I apply for a job, back in the days when I have a job, is that I actually drop different versions of resume for different jobs. Even thinking back in college, if I'm applying for a developer job, I will lead with skill sets with coding. And then if I'm applying for a product manager job, then I lead with product understanding. So you don't have to put all the experience on a single resume. Think about, as a recruiter, is this relevant to me? So less is more. Chris always tells me less is more. And that's maybe something to kind of think about when you're deciding what kind of experience do you actually put in the front matter over there.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I've gone through those machinations in my head in the past, where thinking of the audience or thinking about the particular role. And if you're fortunate enough to be qualified for multiple functions at a company, that's fantastic. And I think that's not a bad idea to have one or two versions that you can drop into the mix.
Yeah. And then not to cut all of them, but let's say if you feel like a particular skill set, let's say, I apply for a product manager job. So previous I was a program manager. They're kind of similar function, but product manager requires a little bit more product thinking. So, I may pull in a experience coming from like my real estate investing or something to showcase that I can own a product, I came up with the product, or come up with a whole, design of the product on my real estate world, which can aid the job that I have. Now, if they're not relevant, then just kind of leave them off the resume over there. The other question I have over here is, what should the sequence be here? I mean, should your tech skills education comes first before the professional experience, or the other way around? Chris, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think I like the order that you've got here, Elisa. So the professional summary, to start with that. And then if you've got like a headline, to have that at the very top, along with professional summary. Skills. So what you didn't have in here, one of the pieces of feedback I had was skills. I don't know if there's a particular skill section that shows up in here. That I would have that come next. Again, because that's to the point of, you don't want to bury that, right? There's going to be skills, whether they're hard or soft, that are going to be relevant to a role you're applying for. So you definitely don't want to bury that lead. So I'd have both of those towards the beginning. Then you have work experience, then educational, volunteer, extracurricular, sort of towards the bottom.
Gotcha.
Which actually was a point that I was going to make. You want to go ahead, Elise?
So with skills then, with my resume in particular in this case, when I describe professional summary, the skill, what are you kind of looking, is it like kind of more a 1 word, 2 words thing that you just list a whole bunch of them?
Yeah.
Is that kind of, okay.
Yep. Yeah. Gotcha. And that's, again, whether there are hard skills or soft skills. And in the case of, if you're applying to be a product manager versus an engineer, the soft skills are going to be more important for the product manager. So you may want to think, what has made me a successful product manager in the past? Is it, collaboration? Is it skills of, influencing? Is it, analytical? Like anything that, can you guys hear me? Lisa, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
think about what's going to be relevant and balance those hard and soft skills out, but have a section that is going to apply for you and for the role.
Gotcha. Cool. Awesome.
And
I'm
then
gonna make that improvement on my resume should I ever need a W-2 job again.
you won't. I'm confident of that.
Thank you. Yes.
And then, so I think having the extracurricular activity like volunteering, mentoring, rock climbing, I don't know. What I've found is like you get, no matter how you slice it, it's going to get boring reading resumes. And so if there is something in there that's just a little bit quirky and unique, and that shows up, and again, and it's real, it just gives you something else to connect with another human about. So I would encourage having those at the end of it, because I've seen some stuff on there that I've had conversations with people about, and it's, it just makes for a little bit of fun at the end of the whole grueling process.
Gotcha.
Cool. Okay, so then let's go to the last sample, John Smith. So yeah, this is 2 pages. So let's see, John, I liked, so to my point that I made earlier about using color, this is like all you need, right? It doesn't need to be like super duper fancy, but this technical knowledge little chart here, that's different. That's unique. That to me would stand out. And it's also very useful, right? It shows exactly how much experience John has in each of these areas that are applicable for the jobs that he's applying to, which presumably are engineering roles. That's super useful. I love that. Like, that to me stuck out. And so that would at least catch my eye at the very least. And then I would continue reading. So that's, you want to go with that. So that's good. The only thing about this, it's a cool layout, but then the words to the left start to feel a little squished to me, because you've got, present, the timeline is verticalized as opposed to showing up on the right-hand side, which it often does. So I like that it's a little bit different, but it starts to squeeze a little bit. So I don't know. That's not that big a deal, but the person doing this may want to think about how you could open up the words, the space for the words on the left a little bit more. But it's different. And then there's no summary introduction for this person. So to my point earlier, having that professional summary, that headline, I think that's important no matter what position you're applying for, no matter what you've done in the past.
And what do you think about, so what about like if we kind of pick a line over here?
I like this. And then he's got co-authored publications, certifications, awards, like that's all good stuff. And that is stuff, it's kind of like when you're applying to college, coming out of high school, they want you to be well-rounded. I think that's just, it's useful for anybody. The more you have that stuff, as long as it's worth putting in there and worth talking about, like put it in there. It's cool.
And then so I noted, on both the resume, I've kind of looked at them. Again, I think areas where we could have improvement over these is like under key accountability, for example, kind of highlighted on, yes, we used these type of technology, and then like maybe lead with an impact or something like, hey, change, because for a senior dev, the impact, like, what are you guys looking for in an interview? Or do you look for like the impact someone has made as a senior kind of dev? For a junior, it's okay. We understand there's, like it's more skill set based, but for a senior dev, like choosing this senior dev versus the other, you're probably looking at leading more like kind of like the impact you've made, like, deliver the product or oversee a product, successfully oversee a product that, reached 1 million users or something like that, right? And then, follow up with like, this is the skill sets, like we kind of brought it over.
And I think the way to think about that, which I didn't mention it specifically in the article, but you want to have a series of stories in your head going into an interview process that you can share with people about those key accomplishments, and think about, okay, if I look over the 3, 4, 5 years, whatever I've spent at this company, what are the things I'm the most proud about? And what are the things that I feel like had something of a lasting impact? And so have those stories like prepared in your mind, and they should be reflective in your resume. So that's where, when you think about the handful of bullet points that are going to show up in each stop along the way, it should be crafted around those stories that you want to tell to your interviewer. and you should word them out that way. So, and I think that's, key accomplishments. I think without reading these specifically, I believe that's what, John Smith has done here. And I think that's great.
Cool. Awesome. All right, so let's kind of shift skills, this into kind of interview. It's kind of funny. Chris and I were joking about it. He's like, I won't be able to fill an hour. I think we're actually would be running out of time over here. Was like a really kind of the meaty section on the interview, what you should be looking for. And again, back to your point about interview, like networking. Oftentimes you don't have to deal with the bot. Because if you already know someone else that is interested, for example, because I worked in Microsoft, for example, for about 10 years or so, I've accumulated all these networks, so I can reach out to Amazon, Google, and etc. So if you have already know someone who knows someone, the best way is to kind of potentially send them an email, forward your resume, but look up the jobs they're interested and say, hey, here are some jobs I'm kind of interested. Can you get me connected with a recruiter on your company? So that's probably the best way to kind of get through the bot versus, trying front way. If you know someone, just definitely get connected that way. Okay, so a couple more questions on the resume stuff, and then we're going to tee this off and move on to the interview session. We have one person asked, what's your opinion on the font size for bullet points? How long, concise should they be? Font size wise, it's something that's human readable, I would think. And Chris has dotted it before that he personally doesn't like to see big giant bullet points, so make the bullet a little smaller. But each should fit in 1 or 2 lines, so 2 lines at maximum, right? If it has to be bullet points.
Yeah, and I think when you're writing, you want to be concise when you're writing in general, right? Like the long extended prose is just, it's hard, right? If you ever, unless you're writing an article for the New Yorker or something like that, that's not, you don't typically want to have long run-on sentences. So try to work on being concise just as a general practice. It's just a better way of writing resume or email or otherwise.
Okay, and then someone's asking about Chris's article. We'll post the link together, so we'll follow up with a recording session. And so Chris's article is actually on his LinkedIn profile. So if you look up Chris's, and then looks like John has just posted over here. So we will include this in our recording email as well to you. Cool. So let's move on to the interview stuff. Let's say if I come to a job, there's always a behavior section of when we're applying for a tech job. I think any other job, like for construction, like I'm not gonna see you using jackhammer. Like it's probably more behavior than not. So how, what are some tips that you have for us? What does the interviewer look for in these sessions?
Yeah, so this gets back to what I talk about in the article is when you're doing your homework on every aspect of the organization that you're going to interview with. And a big part of that homework assignment is to understand their core values and how they play out in reality at that place. And so that ultimately is the most important element of any organization. And it's hard to get a good read from the outside about how they really manifest themselves. But so you've got to do your diligence. Again, to Lisa's point, like knowing somebody is always going to be the best because they're not going to give you a fully honest version about their experience there because they're still working there. They're partly recruiting you. So just, take it with a small grain of salt. But if you know someone and you trust them, they're going to be able to give you a sense of what things are really like. Ideally, if you can find someone who was there and has left and they weren't under bad conditions, they can give you a very good sense of how things really are. But understanding the core values, knowing what the core values are, and trying to study up on that, that is what behavior is all about. And the best companies work core values into their interviewing process. Now, I can't speak for an Amazon. I know Amazon takes their core values very, very seriously, and they're worked into their process somehow. I could speak on behalf of Zillow. When we structured interview loops, we'd apportion the loop in a way that it was a well-rounded loop. So you'd end up having probably 5, 6 people all told that would cover different areas of technical abilities or abilities that apply to the job itself. And then what were the core values that person was then kind of ask questions around. So there was a series of questions built around each of the core values. And so that essentially becomes the behavioral aspect of the interview. So you want to, if you can go in with as best sense that you can get of what that really means for a company, like check out their website, read about them on Glassdoor, read articles, that'll better prepare you for that behavioral part of the interview. But like I said, and this is really important, at the end of the day, you just have to be yourself when you're in an interview process and be authentic and the more awareness you have of yourself and your best behaviors and your worst behaviors, it's going to make you that much more effective in the interview process. And so I mentioned the DISC assessment in my article. There's a bunch of these out there, right? There's Insights, there's Myers-Briggs, there's others, right? These behavioral profile assessments. They all have their ups and downs. DISC, I think, is pretty informative. But the more you know about yourself and go through ways to kind of have that awareness, you're going to have a better sense of what do you do really well and what you don't do very well. Personally, I think, excuse me, and I've been talking with Lisa about this, it actually should be part of the interviewing process for every company. Most companies, in my experience, don't. And there's a variety of reasons as why they don't bring this into the mix. And I think all the reasons are kind of bogus. But at the end of the day, this is going to give you a great sense of, is this person suited for this particular type of position? It's going to show you the types of energy that you lead with, right? And how you behave. So assuming that's not going to be the case for the company you're interviewing for, you can at least do the homework on your end to have your own self-awareness, and that's going to make you much more valuable, because people are going to ask you about what are your weaknesses, what are your strengths. They'll have a variety of different ways in which they get at that, but it's going to come down to that one way or another.
Yeah, that's really cool. Chris and I have been talking about this profile because I'm kind of in the middle of trying to hire people, struggle off my own. And that's, it's very important. The role that I'm hiring for is actually, matching with the people's personality. We don't want to have an employee that is disgruntled, right? Like the other thing is, if you try to make yourself someone who you're not and try to fit into a job, you're going to hate it every single minute once you got it, right? So I think one thing I noticed that, I had my ups and downs in my professional life before, at one point, I was, having to kind of jump to a different company and et cetera. So one of my mentor at the time gave me this talk, and then she's like, this is actually the best moment for you to self-reflect, to kind of think about what you really want applying for. Because you shouldn't have a scarcity mindset. It should be more abundance mindset. Like with your skill set, you can find a job somewhere. Because guys, if you're in the software development environment, there's just more jobs there is software developers to fill it. But you kind of have to have that mentality. So you have to kind of find what's suitable for you to work for the next 2, 3, 5 years, right? To kind of really enjoy the jobs that you're doing. So she always encouraged me to say, hey, strike for the best, or what you dream of. Is there a company that is aligned with your value very much? Instead of just applying for all of them, pick and choose the one that really suit you. So for me, on my second job hunt, I only applied for like 2 companies, right? Because these are the 2 that fits all my other criteria. So, as interviewers that interview you, you also interview them. And Chris, can you tell me, is it kind of interesting if a person being interviewed is asking a lot of questions about your company? Granted, you got to do homework. You can't just be like, what do you do? Or all that sort of stuff. But asking about what the position is going to offer them in future advancement, what are some good questions to ask the interviewers that makes you a very interesting candidate?
Well, okay, so there's a couple of things in there, and you hit on something that I'm going to write about in the future. And the reason I didn't choose to write about now is because I'm trying to be empathetic towards the amount of people who are in tough situations right now, and that they're going to feel compelled to get a job and take a job somewhere where maybe in ordinary times they wouldn't want to take a job. And so I understand that, and it's a crappy situation for us all to be in as humans. But I think you're right, Elisa. You have to really give thought to where do you want to be? And there's a whole other way to think about this, which goes beyond even the function in the company, which is what are the industries and what are the macro trends going on in the world that are of particular interest to you as an individual? And if you start there and then you work your way down to the company and the function, you stand a better chance of being satisfied in your work. As I've seen so many people that just job hop and they company hop, and it starts to become exhausting after a while, right? It's like, what are you really looking for? And that will wear you down over time. And so, yeah, you want to, it's not just doing your homework on like the people you're going to interview with, the leadership, but it's why are you really wanting to go to the place that you're going to? Like that, you want to have a really thoughtful, sincere answer there. Um, and so then you want to ask deep questions, not just about like, what's in it for me from an advanced perspective. You don't want to ask questions like that because that's going to turn an interviewer off. Like you want to understand everything you can about what the company is trying to accomplish, why it's important to them, why it's important to the leaders, why it's important to the founders. Like, and if you get people rallied around something that feels good, like that's a really great thing. And it's a hard thing to establish. Like a lot of companies try to establish this and they fail. But the ones who do a great job of it, they are sustainable and they go on to scale to greatness. So you as an individual need to take that same frame of mind and really research deeply what it is you're looking to go and do and why.
Okay, so on the large company I had an interview with, at the end of the loop, there's always this one executive or GM, your position essentially, come and interview me. I always feel like I'm very nervous about these sessions because with the regular stuff, I feel like I can have a normal one-on-one conversation. So like, can you give me some insight on like the last interview or the one with GM? What did you guys try to get out of it? Like in terms of like interview us, and what are some stuff that you're kind of looking for? Because ultimately when we get to you, it's like enough people have said yes through the loop, at least that's kind of how I understand it. So that you kind of come in as either a tiebreaker or someone to just say final yes. So how do you kind of succeed in the section that with people like you? Yeah.
Well, so if again, thinking back to my Zillow experience, we did have a concept of a bar raiser for a long, long time. And I think we actually started to drift away from that towards the end. And the reason why is because we wanted the loop to be so well structured that you were getting good data and feedback from a variety of people, right? Because it shouldn't, I know this still happens, but it shouldn't be that like I'm the ultimate decision maker. Like it should not be that way. And there were times where I was against the room, and we still hired the candidate. So I was like, okay, like we structured this loop in such a way that we got really good data and feedback from different people who are different. They occupy different functions on the team. They're either internal partners, right? Or they're just someone who brings a different perspective. You want it to be well balanced. And it shouldn't be that there's like an overruling vote at the end, because that puts too much power in that one individual's hand. So that was just the way we started to approach it towards the end. And I actually like that approach much better. But I also recognize that when the executive's coming into the room, that there's just this degree of intimidation that just comes with the title, which is kind of ridiculous. Like, I don't consider myself to be an intimidating person, but I realized because I was an executive that I would sometimes intimidate people without even trying. So I would say I'm just another human. Like, think of me as another human. And to me, I guess from my perspective, and what I mentioned in the article is show that inquisitiveness, show your ability to critically think during the course of that conversation, so that as I'm asking you questions and as we're having a conversation, you are thinking about, oh, interesting, let me ask about this as a result of this. So like just constantly be, like I said in the article, prepare your questions in advance, have that list, but be prepared and be okay with abandoning that if things come up in the conversation that are interesting to you or you want to ask more about. Because to me, like, you got to demonstrate that inquisitiveness, that curiosity, that energy. That is going to get you a lot farther, in my view, than almost anything else. Like, those are like, to me, those are the soft skills that in a lot of roles they really apply. Now I get that some people are not as good at that as that in the moment as others, and I think that's what, quite frankly, is busted about the entire interview process, is that some people are just better at interviewing than others because of their personality, and it's easier for some to think on their feet than others. And so it's not entirely fair that they get points because of that, which, to my point about a balanced interview loop, if you're balancing the loop, you're not just balancing functions, but you're balancing personalities and you're balancing personality types. so that there might be introverts on the loop who better understand and connect with an introverted candidate and vice versa, which is why I should not have a ruling vote at the end of the day, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. So I guess summarize this up is kind of be inquisitive, be yourself. And sometimes when I'm in these loops with Microsoft internals too, they would ask me a solution question. Sometimes they will. Sometimes they're just behavioral questions. So kind of be able to kind of quickly think on your feet. It also depends on the job type. Obviously, if it's a product manager, you get asked about these. And oftentimes it's about what kind of question that you ask rather than solving the problem, right? Because it's the process that people kind of focus more on, is what we're looking for. Okay, interesting. There's another question on the bots.
But someone looks like they found a link. They found a link or something to applicant tracking
clearly
system.
We're working with some developers over here. Reply to the bots for the curiosity. Look up the ATS, application tracking system. Applicant tracking system. Thank you for the information there. I think that's very interesting. I actually never thought about the bots, but it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, they're out there everywhere.
Yeah. So I want to kind of share one more screen over here, which is one of the resumes that I have wrote. And this is for folks who are real estate professionals up here. Yes, we're not really targeting that. But just kind of bring it up. This is my resume. And again, it's not up to date. I have a more up-to-date version. So it depends on the audience, right? So as you see, this resume is a lot more concise, because who is the audience of the resume is my brokers. So I don't have a job anymore, but sometimes I get interviewed by brokers. And to that mind, because brokers are transactional, so they want to look at bullet point. So it's a very different kind of take on that. There's still the professional summary. Like with brokers, all they care is one question: can you close the deal? Right? So try to address that thought by just listing all the holdings that I have, limited partner, the most important is the owner and principal. So it's a very different flavor of this. I just want to throw out there because it sounds like there's some people asking a different kind of like profession. What do you look for? So still a similar format, but how I format it is more bullet points because brokers are transactional. They don't have time to read. So just kind of a different take on that. I'm going to stop sharing over here. Okay, so I think we kind of wraps up this this webinar now. And I was wondering if you have any more other questions that you have for Chris. It can be very specific or very general, right? So here's your time to ask any other questions that you have. Okay. If we don't have any other questions, I think we'll conjure our webinar today. Give us a thumb ups if you think this session was helpful. You can use some of the stuff that you learned over here to translate into your job seeking, and we wish you best luck on finding that dream job.
There's one other point I wanted to make, Elisa, about those DISC assessments. To the extent anybody's interested in checking those out, I've got a link to a resource that folks can use. I think it's a free resource. But I can, after we wrap up, at least I can find the best way to get it out to folks. I don't have it with me right now, but if there's any curious people who want to partake in that, I can get that out there too.
Well, last part of this I want to kind of just mention is, actually we do have some questions over here. Where can we find the recording? So I will be sending out the recording as part of your registration. I have your email. So as a follow-up, I'll be sending out the recording. I typically do have a webinar series. It's mostly to do with real estate. So for a lot of your folks, it's not, related. You may get emails in the future for them. If you're not interested, just unsubscribe. But I will be sending out the recording to that with a landing page, etc. And there is a question about, is there such thing as digital resume, website, social? This is actually a really good point. Thanks, Aaron, for asking that question, because there is. LinkedIn is a very big thing out there right now. As a tech world, if your LinkedIn has no picture, no resume information, like get that ported over there. And that was one of the tips I learned when I have to transition jobs from company to company. If you just do it internal, forward a resume is fine. But if you look at LinkedIn, a lot of people has no like face, pictures and all that sort of stuff. You should probably take a look at LinkedIn and make sure putting your resume into the right format over there. And also this is the networking part, get people to endorse you, right? Get people to endorse you, reach out to an old colleague. This goes back to a networking factor. Once you reach back to a colleague, hey, can you endorse me on LinkedIn? And you can have that conversation. Next question is like, hey, I'm looking for a job, like, right? So it's a kind of really natural way to do it. And also LinkedIn profile that has more endorsement kind of stands out with interviewers if they ever check LinkedIn for you. I think that's a big thing. Answering the resume, the digital resume, that's LinkedIn. Social
And
media.
I would say with that,
Yeah.
make sure you've got a good picture on there. Like I think a lot of people like have like selfies or they've got old pictures. Like spend $100, get a professional shot. Like if you work for a company, they can typically do this for you. If you don't, just get something, because that's the thing that people are going to see. And there's a different way that folks have of interacting with LinkedIn versus a traditional resume. And so I think that just take care to Lisa's point, like make sure that profile is pretty good. And LinkedIn has a good way of kind of stepping you through what you should be doing to kind of build that, but it's important.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. I think that's all the questions that we have over here. Well, it looks like folks like the session. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time over here.
Welcome. It's fun.
And again, we'll follow up with the recording over here, probably be sent out tomorrow. And hopefully if you find this useful, you want to share with your other colleagues that potentially also lost their job or looking for a next best gig. Feel free to kind of share the link as well. Great. Thank
Cool.
you. All right. Stay
Thanks,
safe
Lisa.
and, hopefully the best luck.
Okay. Good luck, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.